In this video, we're going to make a ring out of this mahogany crotch or swirl. It's taken from the trunk of the tree where a large limb comes off and it gives it that really cool swirl pattern. So because this video ended up so long, I just skipped the step of rolling the wood and rolling the core. You can look at some other videos if you want to see that done. But what we're going to do is do an inlay of a couple different powders. Also red, I didn't include that one there. And we're going to mix in a little opal powder just to give it some reflective aspects. And we're going to use these brass tubes to create some really cool cabs to put the inlay into. Also, we're going to do a little wire work with this 22 gauge brass wire. So I've gone through the steps of creating the ring blank by just gluing up the mahogany to the core, and we're going to put it on our ring mandrel and turn it to a good shape. I like to use my carbide rougher to square up the ring before I shape it. I usually use a skew chisel to shape the ring a little better, but we'll just do this to get it nice and flat. A lot of you were curious, what I do to either avoid getting glue on the mandrel or to keep the ring on the mandrel. And it's really not a big deal either way, so what I like to do is just add a couple of drops of glue and just lightly touch it to the blank so that it doesn't spin off, because when you're doing symmetrical work like this, it's a real headache if your band comes free or moves off of your mandrel. After hitting it with a couple of different sandpapers to shape it a little better, add some thin CA just to seal the outside so that we can protect the wood better when we do our inlays. We're going to start with the center inlay for some brass wire. When you're using the point tool to gouge this out, you just want to really take your time, because you can always take more out but you can't add more in, so you just want to grind it down until you think it's close, and then just make sure you're testing how deep it is so you get a really good face on that brass. So now I'm using a hand drill to start my first hole for my cabs. So what I did is I did this first hole by hand, and then I measured the other 5 about a ½ centimeter from the initial hole, and then I'm going to come back with a regular drill and widen these out so that the brass tube will fit in there well. Because this was really hard, I probably would get a drill press to do this, because it was pretty hard on the wood and it took way too much time to measure and cut all these and do them by hand and then with a hand drill. So in the future, that's probably the way I would do this. Now I'm going to use a power drill to bore the hole out a little bigger. This really beat up the wood, and a drill press would have been amazing here, but this is all I had. It actually came out okay though once we finally got the tube in. Because it was so beat up, I added a little thin CA back into those inlays, and that'll just make it stronger. And now I can go back and hit it with this needle file and some sandpaper to make sure the face is really smooth. I decided to go with the smaller brass tube. It'll just fit better in the ring and look a little better. I don't want to take up too much of the wood, but this little pipe cutter really came in handy for cutting out 6 of these little pieces of brass. So once I got all those cut, to get them in there, I just held them with some tweezers and dipped it in a little bit of CA glue and sat it in the inlay and just gave it a tap with a rubber mallet just to make sure it's in there all the way. And that seemed to hold them in there very well. So I could just go through and do all 6 of them, and then we can file them down. Because I'm going to use a sanding disc to flush up all this brass, I decided to add a little bit of CA glue just in the side, just to hold them a little better, and then I'm just going to hit it with some activator to dry those up quickly. It's important to make sure you're rotating when you're doing something like this, because you'll heat the brass up very quickly, sanding it so quickly. And you don't want to melt out your CA glue and have one of these fillings pop out, because it's always a headache to go and redo something you've already done. I got these pretty flush with the disc sander, but I wanted to finish it off with a file just so I didn't take too much of the wood off or anything. It also makes it a lot easier to make sure you're getting all the burrs out of the inside of the tube. But once we get all these cleaned out and everything and flushed up, we're going to do our wire work. The back of the ring was kind of bare, so what I did was make a mark between the 2 cabs, and I'm going to do like a star pattern with brass wire back there. But we found the center, so now what we're going to do is just start grinding that out with a file, and once we have it completely bored out and everything, we're going to add our wire in there. Sometimes when I'm doing a more intricate inlay, I like to use this little hand engraver with a diamond bit just to clear the inlay out a little more precisely, and that just makes it easier to get your wire in there. We're ready to put our brass in, so what we're going to do is start with some of the longer pieces and then work our way to the shorter pieces that have to go in as well. Putting brass between each one of these tubes was definitely the hardest part of this ring. It took a long time, and I could barely even see what I was doing because these are so tiny. But I just took my time, and eventually I got them all in there, and it looked really good. Now I can do the star pattern on the back in brass. This wasn't nearly as hard as the other inlays because, these are half open-ended. So it's easier just to, put the end in and then let it hang off the side of the ring and snip it off. Something I really tried to do was add points on the wires that were going to be going in the diagonal inlays. That's just so there's not any big gaps where it meets the rest of the brass. It's important to do little details like that because, when you get this ring done, you're really going to be able to see this wiring. So it's important to take the time and effort so that it'll look truly great. So finally all the brass work is done, and this probably took about 2 hours to finish up, but now we can just get all that flush with a file first, and then maybe go back with the carbide rougher and some sandpaper to make sure it's really flush. After I've cleaned the ring really well, I'm going to add a little more of that thin CA just so you can really see what the final product might look like. Now it's time to add in our inlays. So what we have here is just a little bit of opal powder and orange sand. All we have to do is add a drop of CA into that inlay and then fill it with the sand until it's nice and flush. Now that we got all those inlays filled, I'm going to come back with that carbide rougher and flush it up so that we can start our clear coating process. Now that the ring is polished and clean, we're ready to start applying our resin clear coat. This is a high viscosity resin that's cured using UV light, so what we're going to do is put it in a UV bath for about 10 minutes until it's totally cured. Now we have to part the ring from the mandrel. As long as you're careful, there shouldn't be any issue doing this. You just have to knock off that little bit of glue that you may have gotten on the band. I know it freaks everybody out when I use the chuck to sand the inside of these on the lathe, so for this one I just went by hand, and I didn't really have to knock much of that celluloid off because I already sized it to what I want. So really I'm just shaping, the sides of the band and making sure they're smooth before I do the dip in the resin. I want to completely encase the ring in the resin, so the first thing I'm going to do is just use a little bit of it to attach the ring to a piece of stainless steel so that I can dip it in there without having to actually touch it. So this resin is really thick, so what I like to do is use a heat gun just to warm it a bit so that the excess will drip off, and then once you have it where you feel like it's got a good coat on it and it's pretty even, you can go ahead and put it in the UV bath. Once the band is totally cured, we're gonna snap off that piece of stainless steel and then just flush up that bead of glue with a file. Because this UV resin is so hard, it would take a lot of time to use a buffing wheel and some compound to get that scuff off of there. So what I like to do instead is just put it back on the mandrel and sand it a bit just to shape it and add another coat of the resin just because it's a lot faster and a lot simpler. After this, it'll just go in the UV bath for about 15 minutes and the ring will be completely done. I wanted to make a ring that was really intricate and had a lot of different design aspects just because I see a lot out there that are very industrial and a little too minimalist for me. But after making this, it has an awesome like medieval look to it, which I really enjoy, and I'm pretty proud of all the brass work that I did on it. So what I'm going to do is give this ring away, so if you want to win it, all you have to do is subscribe to my channel and then leave a comment on this video, and on New Year's Day I'll choose someone at random and I'll let you know if you won.